Hey baby, it's 2 a.m. And I have a nasty headache, so I'm having a gross amount of caffeine, and I'm going to read to you about the housing crisis. So the Australian Council of Social Service, I had not heard of them until today when I was deep in the trenches on Blue Sky, talking shit about John Howard. So let's go over who these guys are first. It's a national advocate supporting people affected by poverty, disadvantage and inequality, and the Peak Council for Community Services nationally. So I've never heard of them. But it's been around since 1956, and it's just, I follow the Australian, is it called the Anti-Poverty Union? Their logo is purple. Not Anti-Poverty Week. Oh god. Anti-Poverty Centre. Here we go. So I know about these guys, but I feel like they're recent. Yeah, May 2021. Because I remember, like, my Unemployed Workers Union reposting some of their stuff. But yeah, Australian Council of Social Service has been around for a long time. And unfortunately, it seems like one of those agencies, you know how the government, Labour in particular, because it actually respects the look of advisory boards and thinks that, having experts on board is something respectable that they should be seen to be doing, even though they keep on, ignoring all of the recommendations. I feel like it's one of those advocacy bodies where they're, always producing really good recommendations, really good papers on the subject, but then only so much gets done, if at all, about what they have to say. Anyway, 11th of March, that was yesterday, it released this article. Housing tax breaks fuel housing crisis and must be fixed. ACOSS is calling on all parties and candidates to support reforms to negative gearing and the 50% capital gains discount and invest the revenue raised in social and affordable housing after releasing analysis showing how the measures have supercharged inequality and contributed to the housing affordability crisis. I've got 2 great articles over here on how John Howard fucked us over with the combo of negative gearing and capital gains tax. So we can get into the weeds with whether or not that's truthful. It definitely is. But it was happening when we were children, late 1980s, early 1990s? Or was it late 1990s, early 2000s? Anyway, we were too little. It's just like those words that have been in the background this entire time. But there was a time before it, and housing... Fuck, do I have any of those graphs up? I did a lot of reading besides the stuff that I've pulled out to read to you today, and it's I'm sure several times I'm going to just think of something else I've read that I want to show you, and it'll be lost in my history. No, it's not one of these. Social housing is a share of housing stock, by the way. We have a gap on the NRAS waiting list of 140,000 Australians, I think was the 2024 numbers that I read, but that's only the people who are registered with the National Residential Assistance Service or whatever NRAS stands for. So the actual sleeping rough or homeless people number, people who are couch surfing, that kind of thing, if I remember correctly, the speculated true number was closer to $260,000. Sorry, dollars. People, and the biggest growing demographic there is middle-aged women, of course. So, what horrifying graphs. Wait, what was the drop in social housing? 1980, 5%. Oh, community housing, if you think of it as not-for-profits, basically, I think the difference between public housing and community housing, they're both social housing, but public housing is like owned by the government, and community housing is like someone in the community is providing that housing, usually like a non-profit or like a municipal effort, something like that, if I remember that distinction correctly. So we've dropped. They should really show us. Yeah, and we haven't been building any. We obviously built a bunch post-war, kept building, and it just fucking tanked in those Howard years. Oh no, it was happening in 2012. I don't remember. Anyhow, it's all bad, baby, and I shouldn't get distracted by this. The ACOSS report, Homes for Living, Not Wealth Creation, includes analysis showing that the wealthiest 10% of households holds 2/3 of the value of investment property. That's so crazy. So that's not even factoring in overseas buyers, which is like not a thing I think should be allowed unless it's primary residence. Let's see. Yeah, that's nasty. The ACOSS reports also finds that the competition for homes from investors increased dramatically following the introduction of the 50% capital gains tax discount in 1999. Investors led two surges in home prices, by 13% a year above inflation from 2001 to 2003, and by 6% a year from 2013 to 2017. Since 1999, home prices have increased by 142%, while wages have only risen 44%. Contrary to the idea that encouraging investment is needed to generate new supply, 81% of investment loans are for existing properties. Australia's absurdly generous tax breaks are supercharging the housing crisis and rising inequality in our society, said ACOSS CEO Dr. Cassandra Goldie. As long as our tax system encourages speculative investment in housing, the housing affordability crisis won't be solved just by building more homes. Independent modelling indicates that halving the capital gains tax discount and curbing negative gearing would reduce home prices by up to 4%, similar to the impact of the government's target to build an additional 1.2 million homes over 5 years. Politicians claim that mum and dad investors are the ones benefiting from these concessions, but our analysis shows that the wealthiest 10% own 2/3 of investment property. And like, mum and dad investors, they shouldn't. This word here, investors, is fucked up. Like, housing is a necessity. It's like really low on the fucking Maslow hierarchy. Everybody needs shelter, and you can't work effectively, can't take your kids to school, can't study or sleep or like worry about other things effectively, especially when your police dedicate a huge amount of their time to just shooing people out of the city for various functions. It's by the city I mean like the streets, or like pushing them out of Musgrave Park or what have you. Housing should not be considered a commodity that you can invest in casually. You can only invest in it in the sense that, oh yeah, I plan to live here permanently, like raise kids here, have a dog here. Like, just the obscenity of calling it an investment and then trying to patch that up with mum and dad investors. Like, if you're wealthy enough, buy the second house in your kid's name and let it be their primary residence, you know? Like, buy your kids a house. You don't invest. It's obscene that you can have more than one in your name. That's fucked up. Yeah, so the general claim is that mum and dad investors benefit from these concessions, but the people with the money to benefit, the people with the ability to outbid in auctions or like participate in blind auctions or just like pay cash up front without dicking around with applications for first home buyers grants and stuff, wealthiest 10% own 2/3 of investment property. These tax breaks disproportionately benefit the well-off in our society, while millions struggle to pay the rent, let alone save a deposit to buy their first home. These unfair tax breaks fuel speculation by investors in housing stock and distort investment decisions, yet do little to increase the supply of rental properties, let alone affordable homes. These tax breaks for investment properties also come at a cost of at least $11 billion each year, which could be invested in social and affordable housing for people with low and modest incomes. Another thing is, like, people with investment homes do dumb shit like become little Airbnb tyrants or rent out, like short-term accommodation. Airbnb often bypasses zoning, what do you call it, like use laws? I know there was a house in the Brisbane suburbs modelled after the Bluey house, which, like, how much money did that take? And it was not in a place with, like, hotels and motels, you know, it shouldn't have been in that zone. Registration for short-term. Board of Landlords and agents to be aware of the legislation. I was really just wanting to see if online booking for a short-term consulted rates increase. I just wanted somebody to give me the clickbait headline of, like, whether or not it was illegal, but I feel like it's at least a pain in the ass to regulate. Check the zoning laws and regulations in your area to ensure that short stay rentals are allowed in a specific location where your property is located. Some areas may have restrictions on operating short stay rentals in certain zones or residential areas. They bloody should. New Airbnb regulations? So this is a 2023 article on ABC News, and ABC News has really gone down the fucking drain in the last 5 or so years, at the very least, you know, since they... God, who was it? Was it under Turnbull that they really started... I mean, it escalated under Morrison, but just, like, cutting all of the funding out, letting people go, and, like, you know, they very obviously got rid of all their proofreaders and shit. Yeah, a bunch of people have introduced rules about it. Airbnb regulations in Brisbane. When was this written? That's just copyright. Where's, like, a gossipy rag talking about how Airbnb is just super legal or is violating laws all over the place? Which side does it fall on? This is just like a random Airbnb host getting flagged for violations. all caps, why does Airbnb permit you to list your property if zoning laws don't allow it? Because it just wants money? Like, it's a fucking little grubby business. I saw the date on this. Yeah, okay, I'll stop getting distracted by that. Okay, back to the ACOSS article. Yeah, so the tax breaks between negative gearing and the capital gains discount on investment properties, there's $11 billion at least that's not getting paid because of the concessions that people are getting under that combination, or these tax breaks, plural. $11 billion, which could be spent on so much other stuff, including like more houses. ACOSS is calling on the next government to halve the capital gains tax discount from 50% to 25% over 5 years, reducing it by 5% per year. Restrict negative gearing for new investments so that investment losses can only be offset against investment income rather than wages, and phase out negative gearing for existing investments over 5 years. Halve the capital gains tax discount for super funds, prohibit self-managed superannuation funds from borrowing to invest in property, and close loopholes in the taxation of super that allow people to avoid paying capital gains tax after they retire. I actually didn't know about the avoiding capital gains after you retire bit here. Like, rich self-funded retirees were fucking having a heyday, weren't they? Invest revenue from capital gains tax and negative gearing reforms into building 47,000 new social and affordable homes per year to address the unmet need of 940,000 homes over 20 years. So that's all super reasonable, and they've even laid out a schedule for it here, which is one of those things where if I just in a conversation get heated and go, no, you need to fucking scrap the capital gains tax, I'm going to be like, oh, if you do that, then suddenly this will, and I was like, okay, no, steel man me for a second, you straw ass bitch. Like, you can do this slowly. I'm not a policy head. That's what policy heads do. Just tell them that you're going to scrap capital gains tax. What's the best way to do it? Some reasonable person like this will make it real gentle for people instead of like pulling a fucking Elon out from under your rug. Key statistics. The top 10% of households by income receive over 4/5, that's 82%, of the $16 billion capital gains tax discount, and nearly 2/5, 93%, of all tax deductions for rental properties. That fucking top 10%. The top decile. Oh my god. Fucking I hate them. Since the capital gains tax discount was introduced in 1999, the median home price has doubled from 4 to 8 times the median income. The proportion of income needed to meet mortgage payments has risen from 27% in 2001 to 49% in 2024, and renters now spend an average of 33% of their income on rent, up from 26% in 2006. And there were plenty of places where, because my pension is... I think my pension is actually on the poverty line because of my disability compared to other people I know whose government assistance is well below the poverty line. Actually, what is the poverty line considered these days? Because my pension used to be under it, but I think it's been adjusted. Inclusive housing cost, the poverty line is $1,145 per week. Oh, for a family of 2 adults. So... when was this? what's the date on this? Oh, come on, 2024 March. Oh, okay, yeah. So I'm hovering on the poverty line at the moment. That's nice. But yeah, there were places I got rejected for renting closer to the city because it would have been more than 30% of my income, and the leasing agent just chucked you from the pile because you're a liability if it takes more than 30% of your income. So it's rough out there. The time required for a median income household to save a 20% home deposit for a median value dwelling has increased from 8 years in 2004 to nearly 11 years in 2024. So over 20 years, saving up that 20% takes about a month these days. Oh, yeah, an additional 50% longer. From 1991 to 2023, the annual number of social housing lettings for people with low incomes declined from 52,000 to 32,000, a reduction of more than 58% when we take account of population growth. Yeah, that's crazy. The poor people just keep increasing because wealth inequality is so bad, and then like the options for renting has shrunk really drastically. That's awful. Revenue raised from reform of the tax breaks could raise $19 billion over 4 years and, subject to development and construction constraints, fund the delivery of up to 49,000 additional social and affordable homes in the future, soon approaching a doubling of the existing federal government commitment to build 55,000 such dwellings. That's with their future fund for housing or whatever, which other things don't get sent their own little future funds, so I'm still not really clear on why they're doing that, but I guess anything to avoid taxing Gina Reinhardt. After several years, annual revenue raised could fund the federal government's contribution to addressing unmet social and affordable housing needs, around $9 to $14 billion per year on average, on top of existing funding, matched by states and territories combined. Yeah, no. They sound very sane, very sober. Owner without a mortgage. That's sad too. Owner with a mortgage. So that's something else I was reading in one of these anti-John Howard things is, yeah, people are stuck in what do you call it? Not like mortgage poverty or something along those lines these days. Renter to a private landlord, renter to a state or territory housing authority. I don't like any of these numbers, babe. This is a nice spread. Change in home ownership by age. Yeah. It's really hitting young people. I guess this was COVID. Population just dropped off. Oh yeah, it says so. Average household size. What do they mean by credit here? I'm really not a fan of whatever font they're using, but I have a hard time. It's that Erlen syndrome thing I have where just like black text on a white background fucking hurts my eyes. Everything swims a bit more. I'm surprised by these loans for new construction, actually. Yeah, lowest income quintile. Must be nice. National rental housing vacancy rate. I wonder where that is now. I feel like Purple Pingers, I think it is, does really good work identifying vacant properties, where it says land banking and they refuse to. Either the house is fully in disrepair or they can't get people in for the market rate of rent and they don't want to reduce, the asking price, so these places just sit there empty for ages. Wow. Jeez. And again, that 2011-2012 spike. Alright, this report's hurting my eyes. I'm just gonna slap a bookmark on that so we can go back to it if we want to. Yeah, so this is an independent news website, publisher, journal. John Menadue's Public Policy Journal, Pearls and Irritations. But yeah, as independent outlets go, I found this one pretty good. Keith Mitchelson, I couldn't find anything particularly interesting on when I had a cursory Google of his name. So, was the housing crisis caused by government policy? Tell us, Keith. Oh, this was published September 2024, by the way. The housing crisis plaguing Australia is the direct result of coalition taxation policies that favour individuals with capital and assets and disadvantages individuals on wage incomes. In 1999, John Howard reduced the capital gains tax liabilities by 50% for individuals, after Labor had introduced the capital gains tax in 1985. The reduction resulted in a boom in investment in existing housing, an instant earning asset, and it prompted richer individuals to transfer income into capital gains to reduce personal tax liabilities. Howard's reduction of the capital gains tax, rather than bringing an expected increase in the number of capital gains transactions, instead saw a 10% fall in reported capital gains transactions in the 3 years from 1999 to 2002, which led to a fall in government tax revenues. So immediately, it didn't work out. Fuck you, John. Having engineered a windfall gain for Liberal voters, the next year, 2000, the Coalition introduced the Good and Services Tax to bolster lagging tax receipts. The GST replaced regional and state taxes with a single unified tax, restoring federal and state incomes, but it inadvertently taxes a higher proportion of income from the poor than from the rich. Inadvertently, I should have scare quotes, I feel, because it's the same as here, where he's like, oh yeah, there'll be more capital gains transactions, but all you see is like the rich people sitting on, just like buying up existing housing and then sitting on it. So at least that's how I'm interpreting this. The reduction in capital gains tax resulted in a boom in investment in existing housing, so like people buying it up, right? And it prompted rich individuals to transfer income into capital gains to reduce their personal tax. Because, oh no, I spent it on housing. I don't have to pay on my income so much now, or what have you. God, I don't have the policy brain to actually, is there a way to dark mode this damn page? I have it as a default, so that's not what I want. Yeah. Anyway, bear with me. I've probably gotten some of these acronyms reversed. But straight up, so Labor brings in capital gains tax in 1985. You're paying a tax when you make these capital gains. John Howard reduces that tax and he's like, well, more people will make these transactions now, but you get a 10% fall in the reported transactions in 3 years immediately after he does that. So a fall in government tax revenues, and so at the state and federal level, but his Liberal voters are feeling really good. They don't have to pay so much tax, and they're in a position to actually make capital gains. So then he introduces the GST, unified tax, restores federal and state incomes, but inadvertently, again scare quotes, inadvertently taxes a higher proportion of income from the poor than from the rich. Of course, with virtually a decade of flatline wages and rising price inflation, the GST now tracks inflation rather than disposable income of households, with disproportionately greater pain to low-income households. And this is a little bit confusing to me because I'm not sure which decade he's talking about. After 25 years of Howard's capital gains tax relief, the unstoppable boom in house sales continues apace, yet it occurs without a concomitant boom in house construction. Now, what's he linked to? A Reddit post. Weird choice. Oh, Deloitte Access Economics newsletter. Annual dwelling completions per 1,000 people. That's a cute infographic, but I think the ACOSS bars are probably a better thing to link to now that we have them rather than a Reddit post. Like, why wouldn't you go straight to Deloitte to link that picture? Was it paywalled? Anyway, weird choice by Mr. Mitchelson here. There hasn't been a concomitant boom in house construction sufficient for this gangbuster demand for housing. The rate of annual construction has fallen from a high of almost 10 houses per 1,000 population in 1970 to just over 6 per 1,000 today. Many economists decried Howard's capital gains tax discount as terrible, noting similar policies introduced by several earlier Republican U.S. presidents had disastrous effects on U.S. interest rates and housing markets and subsequently caused crises in global economy. Yeah, like, fuck Reagan. Fuck Reagan. Him and his little trickle-down bullshit. What's he linked to here? Oh, 20 years ago. Howard's crackpot capital gains tax reforms fail. 2004, so that was 5 years after he brought them in. Yep, Reagan, we saw that coming. And then, yeah, they had all of the Bushes and Georges that came after him. Capital gains tax is an abomination, yeah, I agree. The discount on it, anyway. So yeah, he knew what he was doing, and he looked to the US and he was like, yeah, you know what, housing is a luxury. If you're not investing, then rent, and if the rent goes up, too bad. So how does the manufactured housing market work? When Howard discounted the capital gains tax, house prices in the luxury end of the market immediately began to rise. Expensive house sales were widely reported, and estate agents soon suggested every client set ever higher prices for their properties. I mean, you see that now with rentals as well. They don't care what the paid amount is. As soon as they convince people to pay their new price, they go around convincing everybody, oh yeah, no, like, it's rising, you should really, like, increase your rent ask to you know, follow the trend or whatever. They're just pushing their own commissions up constantly. So fucking greasy. Banks are also prime players in higher house prices. They favor mortgage loans to low-risk and wealthier borrowers and covet ever larger mortgages regardless of the interest repayment rates. Soon every homeowner in the early 2000s was agog with rising house prices and of course felt much richer thanks to the coalition. The gentrification of working-class neighborhoods continues apace as fortunate home buyers move into older inner-city suburbs and prices become unaffordable for children of working families who had lived there for generations. Like, tell Albanese that. Despite less than 7% of houses being sold in any one year, all houses are potentially beneficiaries of the increasing prices when eventually marketed. Layered on top is the attraction of Australian housing for overseas investors and for illicit money laundering by locals and others. What link has he got for us now? CoreLogic Property Polls, the long game, 30 years of housing values. Oh my god. Brisbane and Melbourne dwelling values up 22% in a year, Labour form government, July 07. Jeez, that's, yeah, 92, 97, capital gains rules changed here. as it's rising slowly and then it really picks up. Because Australian house prices grow at inexplicable rates, divorced from the well-being of the economy, investors and speculators across the world see property here as a safe haven for growing the value of assets, particularly more expensive assets. Many economists have observed that those willing to purchase a home are now often outcompeted by bidders backed by significant capital. Yeah, you see, like, those mum and dad buyers that they talked about earlier, like the old rich people, they're like picking up another property when the young couples who've barely scraped together 20% at an auction, and auctions on housing shouldn't be legal either. Like, I feel like property evaluators should come in and set a fucking price tag, and then the seller picks someone they like. Like, you shouldn't. The idea of auctions, again, it's not a commodity, it's a necessity, and it ought to be a right. I certainly consider it, like, morally a right, but if we could get policy to get close to acknowledging that, that would be nice. And the other, like, overseas owners can exist, is crazy too. I don't like that at all. Like, for residential property, I mean, didn't we lease one of our ports, basically sell it to China as it is, and then I feel like we had the US did something. Oh, yep. Project came as fuel tanks for US military built unlawfully on Darwin Harbour, so that's not selling them a port, but, you know, the US military fucking reams the coalition constantly, so what am I surprised by? High-end secrecy and money laundering is dragging the property market higher, by Michael West. So we love Michael West, Mr. Independent, yeah, but when did September 2024? Okay. A rise in secrecy by property owners can only exacerbate the housing crisis. Who really owns these towers? I see the logic in non-residential property being owned by Australian companies, but the idea that you can have international, like, non-domestic companies owning property, whether it's residential or not, is insane to me. And I feel like if you're a foreign party owning a residential property, it should be at least your primary residence for significant chunks of the year, you know. I'm not money-brained enough to figure out the sleight of hand involving fucking laundering money this way, but capital gains tax relief is a significant factor too, because the wealthy of Sydney and Melbourne have been mansion flipping for 15 years, making massive tax-free profits on the sale of their family home, in scare quotes. Some have done it 2 or 3 times. Channel 9 is funded by property ads. We don't see many stories about money laundering. Oh, right. When he says secrecy, he means, like, these unknown actual owners who are using these companies as a front for their purchase. The owner does not have to be a director of the company, but can appoint the directors, and the shareholders may entail more layers of companies or trusts to hide the beneficial owners. Trusts do not have to disclose their beneficiaries. I mean, yeah, for a commodity, I guess that makes sense. And my argument would be that if you change the nature of housing to be considered a necessity, that you should be able to have trickle-on effects where that's not possible. The government did promise to institute a beneficial ownership register when it was in campaign phase, but has yet to do so. Oh, how easy. I Attorney General Mark Dreyfus pledged to introduce Tranche 2 of the AML-CTF reforms, money laundering reforms, but is yet to unveil the legislation, and he has foreshadowed that it may be watered down from fully capturing lawyers, accountants, and property. Like, just get it started. We know it's going to be watered down. You water everything down. If you're not going to give us dental and Medicare, the least you can do is get your other shit started. But I know, like, ASIC is fucked too. What is it? That's the Corruption Commission, right? No, that's the Securities and Investment. I forget what the other one is. I'll find that article and or like the 600 articles on that and read it to you another time. Yeah, it's only a crisis for those who don't have property. For those who do, it's great. Look at this massive 5-head. Good for you, Michael. Yeah. Crowding out has also contributed to the sustained increase in house prices and is now expected by the real estate industry. Another of Howard's last measures in 2007, allowing holders of self-managed superannuation funds to invest their portfolios in housing, means that some bidders come to auctions backed by $1.5 million or more in funds. In 2023, some $60 billion for house purchases came from this source alone. Jesus Christ. The housing crisis is thus one where investors realized that housing, or property, gave significantly higher returns than any other form of investment. Naturally, they moved their portfolios and are now reinforcing an unstoppable increase in their wealth. Yet, as Harry Chimay noted, speculating in existing residential property doesn't meaningfully add to the nation's ability to create, build and trade, or to grow the national economy sustainably. It just increases inflation. And this is like another place where I feel like societies get rich, like a banker brain that we have. Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. Ban self-managed super funds acquiring residential property. Reducing foreign holdings of residential property, the Hunger Games. Okay, that seems like it's covered by another article that I have already, but that's good. Yeah, that kind of like, what do you call it? I suppose it's like clickbait capitalism, that kind of mentality of the grind set, that like hustle culture where you shouldn't be jealous of people for being rich at your expense, you should just try to get rich yourself. And the way that kind of applies to housing, like, oh yeah, it's just gonna always increase in value, so you just gotta get in at the ground floor, and it doesn't matter if you live in a place where your work isn't accessible, or like I lived in a dump when I was young, like all of that bullshit. It's like, okay, so like if things can be better, they should. Life and certainly not governance of a society is not about material profit. It's about what is Bhutan's like gross national happiness. Yeah, good governance is considered a pillar for happiness because it determines the conditions in which the Bhutanese thrive. All policies and programs that are developed in Bhutan are generally in line with the values of gross national happiness. There are also a number of tools and processes. Oh god. Good governance, cultural resilience in a vital community, ecological resilience, sustainable and balanced economical development. Like, yeah, you can't just choose growth for no reason. It's whatever famous person said, unchecked growth is the philosophy of a cancer cell. Yeah. It's, oh, he'll be good at leading the government because he's made so much money. No. The governance of a society means caring about other people and bringing everybody up with you, not grossly stretching out at the inequality gap so that you can say, hey, look at our GDP. Anyway, I'm preaching to the choir. I'll keep going. The housing crisis is thus one where investors realised that housing and property gave significantly higher returns than any other form of investment, and self-managed superannuation funds were able to pull out from their portfolios to buy housing outright with whatever many millions that they might have. I know that Dutton was talking about people, like ordinary people, being able to draw from their superannuation for housing recently. Super to buy a house. Can you use super to buy a house? First home super saver scheme, buying a house with self-managed super fund. So that's not it. Yeah, as late as 2023, that wasn't an option. Yeah, so March 2024, allowing first-home buyers to access their super to get into the property ladder will drive up house prices if the move is not coupled with significant efforts to reduce supply, blah, blah. So ordinary super, that wasn't an option. It was only if you had self-managed superannuation funds, and I don't know anything about the material difference between one super fund and another. Material difference? Like, just the difference. But it does sound like if you're self-managing, you're just like a rich kid playing stocks with your own savings, and it follows slightly different rules because it's super. I will have to read up on that one day, but I'm never going to have a self-managed super fund, so... The Reserve Bank of Australia is tasked with controlling inflation in the economy, but has high interest rates only to curb popular spending, hopefully inducing cabals to moderate their prices. Unfortunately, high interest rates are also inflationary, making it a very painful medicine. Yet the continuing rampant purchasing by wealthy housing speculators shows their immunity to higher interest rates. Rather, they rely on it to crowd out competing bidders. The crowding out of ordinary buyers has meant many are trapped as renters for extended periods, or that middle-class children must borrow or be gifted from the bank of mum and dad. In effect, savings from the lower side of the economic distribution are now flowing ever faster into the pockets of the rich, and especially to the banks. Meanwhile, the government is trying to address the shortage in low-cost housing from the supply side, but their measures are insignificant and much too slow to be effective. The coalition claimed that our present economic pain is entirely the fault of Labour. The coalition claimed that our present economic pain is entirely the fault of Labour does have some credibility. Inflation is the key driver of the economic crisis, and it is fueled by the government's failure to rein in the domestic drivers of inflation. The price gouging supermarkets, gouging landlords, energy suppliers, airlines, and the raging housing market, to mention the obvious. The Crossbench and the Greens have made numerous proposals to curb these sectors since 2022, but the government has only held inquiries to blame and shame the perpetrators, hoping they would mend their ways. If inflation is falling, why are prices of essentials still rising so quickly? Well, partly because once they realised that they could jack up their prices during COVID lockdowns, they kept their prices super high, and they made increases in their rate of profit during COVID massively. Consumer price inflation. Essential spending, discretionary spending, RBA inflation target. Essential versus discretionary consumption, annual percentage change. Employment in the last 12 months. Supply has been uneven. Net overseas arrival by business type. What's that? I wonder if there's an Australian equivalent for I don't know. What was the top 20%? Top 20% doing Australia's wealthiest 20% are worth 90 times the country's poorest. I'll go off DuckDuckGo and have a look at Google, but there was that really interesting article I think I showed you the other day where Americans, it looked like their economy was doing fine, but it was because the richest people were buying so much more. Oh, it really was the top 10%. Yeah. February 25th, 2025, the wealthiest 10% of US households now represent nearly 50% of consumer spending. Apparently Fox Business recorded this, so fuck Murdoch, but let's see where he got his numbers. The report, authored by Moody's Analytics chief economist Mark Zandi, found that the top 10% of US households in terms of earnings, defined by making $250,000 or more per annum, account for 49.7% of consumer spending, a record since at least 1989. Do they provide the report anywhere? No, they don't. Okay, so that's the case in America. No idea about us, but that's, oh damn. Yeah, governments failure to rein in domestic drivers of inflation, price gouging supermarkets, gouging landlords, energy suppliers, airlines, and the raging housing. Energy suppliers again, I think I showed you. I think it was Howard again. Was it gas or was it oil? Yeah, okay, this was written in 2017, but how Australia blew its future gas supplies. Da-da-da, da-da-da. I was in the Canberra Press Gallery in 2002 when Prime Minister John Howard called a press conference to announce, with the widest grin he could manage, that after years of negotiation, Australia's mining interests had pulled off a $25 billion deal to supply China with liquefied natural gas. It was, crowed Howard, Australia's biggest single export deal ever. Needless to say, I'm absolutely delighted. Blah, 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 blah. Gold medal performance. By 2015, so 13 years later, it was being called the worst deal ever done. The Chinese by then were paying about 1/3 the price for Australian gas that Australian consumers themselves had to pay, and they were guaranteed to continue doing so. The Chinese had gotten the deal of a lifetime because the consortium of Australia's Northwest Shelf operators hadn't thought to insert a clause into the contract that would raise the price of gas from what it was in 2002, a historically low level. So do we have any, well, this is 2017, so let's see if we can get some graphs. Is that the same year, 2017. Since Howard made the announcement, the value has increased by 1,041% according to figures from the Department of Industry, Science and Resources. Australia is now shipping about 3/4 of the gas that it produces. In 2019 to 2020, we produced thousands of petajoules, of which 74% went overseas. That left 1,647 petajoules that was used in Australia for domestic purposes during the year, including for power generation, heating and manufacturing. I'm pretty sure they approved Woodridge. They're always trying to approve new gas and fracking things going on, but they definitely approved another one recently. And it's just like, we don't need it, because we're not getting this money. Yeah, Australia missing out on $13 billion in royalty revenue from gas projects, report says. The Australia Institute estimates, so that's essentially a centrist think tank, estimates that state and federal governments have missed out on $13.3 billion of royalty revenue that should have been charged on gas exports during the past 4 years. Gas exported from 6 of Australia's 10 LNG exports facilities pay no royalties on the gas they sell overseas. 4 of these projects are based in WA. Now, do we have the breakdowns for any of this? Not here. Let me see. Oh yeah, Australian Institute, cool. And then I feel like they might address Japan, but I feel like Japan buys from us to sell for more to their neighbours. So, okay, that's too much. I don't want to dig into that. Gas exports, 50% given to corporations royalty-free, and this was May last year. Around 80% of Australia's gas is exported as liquefied gas, LNG. Most of the gas is extracted from blah blah blah. Key findings. No royalties are paid on 56% of the gas that is exported from Australia, including 73% of gas exported from WA. Last 4 years, multinationals made so many billions of dollars. At least $30.3 billion could have been raised. No royalties are paid on gas. Gas is given away essentially for free, said Mark Ogg, Principal Advisor at the Australian Institute. In the words of the WA Treasury, a royalty is the purchase price for a community-owned resource, and the community expects a fair return for its petroleum resources. How the fuck are you paying nothing on 70% of it, then? However, in many cases, Australians are getting no return at all for the sale of their gas. If you engaged an agent to sell your house for the best price, but instead gave it to their mate for free, you would be angry. Okay, no, I stumbled over my words there, but you get my point. The federal government's future gas strategy does not mention the words royalties, tax, or return in its entire 67 pages. That's bizarre. Oh, how do they describe themselves? Independent public policy think tank based in Canberra. Funded by donations from philanthropic trusts and individuals, and commissioned research. We back for ideas, not political parties or candidates. Oh, 1994. Honestly, yeah, it consistently puts out good stuff, and it's just nice that we have something that's not fucking focused on the family bullshit in our policy space. Oh, and here's a comparison between us and Qatar. and I don't understand. It really doesn't make sense. Yeah, that's crazy. Japan using Australian gas to shore up regional influence. And this is a 2024 article. Japanese energy companies are on selling surplus Australian gas to allies in Southeast Asia to shore up its influence in the region against China while securing its economic future as an energy trader. And they are not paying royalties on a lot of that, according to those other documents. I mean, it could be maybe that 56% distribution excludes Japan, and they're paying like the only royalties that this country even takes, and is just selling the excess to its neighbors, like respectfully, and not just like taking shit from our backyard and then slapping a price tag on it. But it certainly seems like that. The Australian Taxation Office has called oil and gas systemic non-payers of tax. The Australian government receives more money from income tax paid by teachers, HEX repayments, and beer excise than taxes paid by Chevron, Exide, Woodside, that's not Woodridge, and Shell combined. Gas companies make $55 billion in 2023 because the war in Ukraine increased world energy prices. Despite the record-breaking revenue, payments to government from petroleum resource rent tax were lower in 2023 than in 2001. That's insane. I want to know what they are paying, and like, what is the rate? Like, someone's getting paid, obviously, and we know a lot of, especially coalition guys, go into coal and fossil fuels and all of that kind of thing afterwards. I think like that Kavanagh guy currently has a brother in coal, and he's always dressing up in his little coal outfits to talk about how good it is. And like Scott Morrison took his lump of coal into Parliament to wave it around and be like, look, it's not scary. But how traceable is the money, and like, where is it going to? The ATO has labelled 102 companies systemic non-payers of tax, releasing new corporate transparency figures that showed a $4 billion boom in receipts from the mining and energy sector. This was 2019. I'll just get the damn ATO. Oh, just went to the same one. Okay, I've gotten completely sidetracked. There are 27 gas companies that earned $77 billion in revenue without a single cent in tax being paid between them. Is there a... Oh, this is a media release, so... 1 in 3 corporations pay zero tax. Oh, the source was the Australia Institute, so I would have to go back to that website and dig around to have a look at that. But yeah, okay, so when you're talking about Labor's failures, yeah, the duopoly, but in fairness, some of the energy supply issues do come back to Howard. At least that 30-year deal with China does. But Labor hasn't done anything significant about these that I'm aware of. I don't know what's going on with airlines, but I wish we still had Ansett. The Crossbench and Greens have made numerous proposals to curb these sectors since 2022, but the government has only held inquiries to blame and shame perpetrators. Yeah, they love to do that. And these perpetrators have not changed their ways. Bill Shorten bravely offered policies at the 2019 election to redress the Howard GST discount and negative gearing. Perhaps, as polls now indicate, that the public would like Howard's legislation to be removed, then we could begin to repair Australia's economic woes. It will not be all plain sailing, though, as lower interest rates from the RBA will likely stimulate another increase in house prices and further rentier investment. The Howard government brought in these measures, which are now seen to clearly benefit an undeserving section of the population at the cost of the majority. The Albanese government could, with courage, reverse them and curb ongoing inflation. So yeah, people are starting to cotton on that it's not good, and they do want the change. So bankers on the cards. I'm interested in, like, the 2019 election was just too early to be bringing that up. I'm surprised, but you know, I've always been aggro. Supermarkets, airlines, and power companies are charging exploitative prices despite reaping record profits. Yeah, February last year. The former Australian Consumer and Competition Commission boss Alan Fells on behalf of the ACTU. The inquiry found inflation, questionable pricing practices, lack of price transparency and regulations, lack of market competition. Yeah, dude, does Australia... I feel like Australia has antitrust laws, right? Like, just because it's a duopoly doesn't mean that... I feel like they've definitely been in trouble for... What's the collusion for, like, price setting and racketeering. Anyway, they're shit. Supply chain problems and unrestricted price setting by retailers are to blame for fueling the increases. They released a report on Wednesday. It's one of 4 such reports. The other 3 are being undertaken by the Senate Committee, the Queensland Government, and the ACCC. Prices versus inflation, how prices are set, aviation. Australia's largest and highest profile aviation company, Qantas, has been accused of price gouging since the pandemic. Yeah, I believe that. The banking industry, I mean, how many of the Banking Royal Commission recommendations did it ever even implement? I feel like they commit millions of crimes every year. Yeah, childcare is unaffordable, but childcare workers are also paid kind of shit, so there needs to be something else going on there besides just, like, making it cheaper. I don't think the price is enough. Price bidding system for electricity. The inquiry was critical of the profit margin of AGL, a leading electricity retailer. It would seem that AGL needs to explain why consumers are paying $60.10 per megawatt hour more than seems to be justified by cost differentials. That is, for every consumer bill of $1,000, there is an apparent excess to be explained of $205.61 relative to prices charged to large business customers and not accounted for by genuine cost differences. What the fuck? We're not all paying too much? Food prices have increased well above the inflation rate. This is 2004, like, most of the supply chain stuff. Through farmers recently accused supermarkets of making too much profit from their crops. Yeah, I believe that. That seems like something that's in the news regularly, like every year for the past 10 years. Issues common to all sectors. Yeah, these are not unlawful, but it's significant, and cost of living is hurting absolutely everybody. Inquiry into price gouging and unfair pricing practices. Australian Council of Trade Unions. Yeah, I don't want to dig into that right now. Okay, done with this one. The Saturday paper. April 13, 2024. Although there are now no simple solutions, the housing crisis in Australia can be traced back to a handful of catastrophic policy choices made by John Howard and recommended by his friends, by Mike Seccombe.
the men and decisions behind Australia's housing crisis. The crude political calculus behind Australia's housing crisis was never more clearly expressed than by John Howard during an interview on Brisbane Radio on September 19, 2003. Since the election of the coalition government in 1996, house prices had doubled. Howard's interviewer wanted to know what the government planned to do about it. The answer was nothing. I haven't found anybody in 7.5 years shake their fist at me and say, "Howard, I'm angry with you for letting the value of my house increase," the then Prime Minister said. I haven't found anybody in 7.5 years shake their fist at me. I feel like found. Was that transliterated wrong? Transcribed? That line has been cited with increasing frequency over recent times as the crisis has worsened. More revealing, however, was what followed. The interviewer responded, "Let me be the first to complain. People like myself are actually being forced to face a possibility that we may be renting for the rest of our lives because getting into..." Howard cut him off. "Did you own a home?" Host, "No, I rent." Howard, "No, well, I'm sorry. I was talking about people who owned a home." Howard could hardly have been more dismissive of those locked out of housing, nor could he have been clearer in his view that a house was not so much a home as an investment. As far as he was concerned, the interests of the people who owned homes were paramount. Back then, in 2003, that was more than 70% of people, although the idea of what it meant to own a home also changed substantially during the Howard years. When he came to power, about 42% of people truly owned their homes, free and clear with no mortgage. Just over 28% had mortgages. By the time he gave that interview, there were more homeowners with mortgages than without. When Howard came to power, house prices and average wages had been ticking up roughly in parallel for decades. Then, quite suddenly, prices zoomed far ahead of incomes. They have kept zooming ahead, with only a couple of minor interruptions ever since. Between 2001 and 2022, house prices grew more than 400%, more than twice the pace of wages. A pandemic could not stop them. Falling real wages and increased interest rates could not stop them. A report out this week from Oxford Economics predicted the national average house price would be more than $1.3 million by 2027. As Alan Kohler noted in his recent quarterly essay on the housing crisis, the shift that occurred around the turn of the millennium has altered everything about the way Australia operates and the way Australians live. He's not wrong. Back then, less than 20% of households were in the private rental market. Now it's close to a third. And to an ever-increasing extent, they are under financial stress. At the last census, in 2021, a record 122,000 Australians were homeless. That number has likely increased as rents have escalated and housing supply has fallen even further below population growth. In 2002, the average retirement age was 55, and only 4% of homeowners aged over 65 carried mortgage debt. By 2020, the average retirement age was 64, and more than 50% of homeowners aged 55 to 64 still had mortgage debt. Jesus, it jumped from 4% to 50? It's blissful that it was ever 4%. Older people can't afford to retire, and younger people can't afford... The average retirement age was 64 in 2020? In 2002, the average retirement age was 55. Oh wow, so it, Right, I got mixed up because it was homeowners over 65. And this mortgage debt number is a little bit confusing. It's not a direct comparison, it's just that age range, whereas this is over 65. But the average retirement age in 2002 was 55, and in 2020 it was 64. Oh, jeez. You gotta spend... That's so good. And it's more than 64 now, yeah. Older people can't afford to retire, and younger people can't afford to leave their parents' homes. The cost of housing has been blamed for couples putting off having children and having fewer of them. It's not all John Howard's fault. Over the preceding decade, the government had all but given up on directly building houses in the belief, misguided, that the private sector could do it better. However, it was on Howard's watch that the big shift began, and it was his government that purposefully pursued tax policies that made things worse than they would otherwise have been. In that 2003 interview, Howard was asked about one of them, negative gearing. He said that he would not countenance winding back that tax break for property investors because that would result in rents going through the roof. This claim, still made today by some defenders of the tax breaks that benefit property owners, infuriates Saul S. Lake. It's a lie, says the veteran economist, and it's a big lie. The basis of the lie is a decision made by the Hawke government in 1985. Bob Hawke and then Treasurer Paul Keating abolished negative gearing on rental properties, only to reinstate it in 1987, following sharp rises in rents in Sydney and Perth. So they abolished negative gearing in 1985. 2 years later, they reinstated it because Sydney and Perth are all of Australia. Like, how sharp were these rises in rent? S. Lake and others point out that the rises in those two cities were a consequence of a shortage of supply. In Brisbane and Adelaide, rents actually fell, and the abolition had no impact anywhere else in the country. Still, Labor buckled in the face of a thoroughly dishonest campaign by then opposition leader John Howard, vested property interests, and the usual media suspects. And the one good thing about John Howard being so, convivial and, having strong leadership qualities and vision, despite being so incredibly malignant, is that they basically haven't had anyone with charisma since him. The restoration of negative gearing, which allows rental property owners to claim a tax deduction against their other income if they receive less in rent than they pay out in interest and other associated costs, was not the worst of it. In 1999, acting on advice from one of Howard's friends, the businessman John Ralph, the Howard government halved the rate of capital gains tax payable when properties were sold. For example, if an investor bought a property for $400,000 and subsequently sold it for $500,000, they would only be taxed on half their gain, $50,000, rather than $100,000. This was done at the marginal rate of tax, which meant those in higher tax brackets received a bigger benefit. Until the Howard government did that, says S. Lake, what negative gearing essentially did was allow you to defer tax on part of your wages and salary income, because when you ultimately sold the property, you paid tax on the real capital gain. S. Lake says that the then treasurer, Peter Costello, fuck that guy, but I think he's no longer in charge of 9. Or was it 7? Actually, let me look at that. Nine Entertainment chairman, yeah. More than a decade, 8 years as chairman. Nasty piece of work. Anyway, news outlets. I got distracted. When the then treasurer, Peter Costello, changed the capital gains tax regime, it became a strategy not just for deferring tax, but permanently reducing it. The promise was that halving of the capital gains tax would result in a more dynamic economy and more investment, including in building more homes, which would improve housing affordability. Furthermore, the theory went, cutting capital gains tax would dramatically increase the number of capital transactions, such that there would be no impact on tax revenue flowing to government. It was supply-side economic sophistry, in S. Lake's view. I recall Ralph saying we would turn Australia into a nation of shareholders and entrepreneurs, he said. Instead, it turned us into a nation of landlords and property speculators. The shift in Australians' attitude to housing, from seeing it as somewhere to live to seeing it as an investment and a source of wealth, did not happen overnight. However, the capital gains tax decision certainly played a big part. Almost 60 years of history since Menzies introduced the first home owners grant scheme at the instigation of the Young Liberals' then President John Howard, shows that anything that allows Australians to pay more for housing than they otherwise would have has resulted in more expensive housing, not in more people owning houses. Oh wait, no, this isn't just they've quoted from a different part of the text. Australians' attitude has shifted from a necessity to wealth grind scheme. The capital gains tax was a big part of that. Given the double incentive of being allowed to claim a tax break for the cost of buying and maintaining a rental property, and then another tax break on the capital gain when the property was sold, investors piled in. In the early 1980s, when the Hawke government began worrying about negative gearing, only about 6% of taxpayers were landlords. By 2010, that had jumped to 19%, said S. Lake. Throughout the past decade, it's been about 20%. The cost to government revenue is astronomical. The most recent Treasury figures released in January, so this is 2024, expect foregone revenue due to rental property deductions in the 23 to 24 financial year will total $27.1 billion, with the benefits flowing overwhelmingly to wealthier Australians. This represents 37% to the top 10% of income earners and 65% to the richest 30%. When it comes to the capital gains tax discount, the tax benefits are even more skewed towards the rich. Treasury estimates foregone Treasury estimates foregone revenue this financial year, the 24 to 25 financial year, will be just over $19 billion, which is, I think, what the Australia Institute also said, with more than 80% going to people in the top income decile. So yeah, that top 10% again. And according to Keith Mitchelson, we don't know who some of those guys are. Like, they're buying through companies. And then the beneficiaries of trusts don't currently have to be disclosed for things like property ownership. In sum, the tax changes made by the Howard government 25 years ago failed to produce any of their promised benefits. They did not result in greater housing supply because most speculators bought existing stock. Instead, they resulted in huge cost to government, and they widened inequality by putting more money in the pockets of people who were already wealthy. Most importantly, they did nothing to reduce the cost of buying or renting a home. So the question Howard's interviewer asked back in 2003 remains: why hasn't something been done? Ahead of the 2016 election, the Labor Party did propose reform to reduce the capital gains tax discount from 50% to 25% and to end negative gearing for existing homes. It claimed that the changes would raise $32 billion over a decade, and that restriction of negative gearing to new builds would increase the stock of housing, make homes more affordable, and generate construction industry jobs. Labor picked up 14 seats in the election, but the coalition squeaked home with a majority of just 1. Encouraged by the result, Labor not only kept those policies but proposed other economic reforms at the next election in 2019, including to franking credits, a policy few understood and that opponents maliciously equated to a retirement tax. Labor's vote went backwards, and it subsequently dumped the policies along with its leader, Bill Shorten. It's cowardly and annoying. Just as happened after then Treasurer Paul Keating attempted to wind back tax breaks in the 1980s, Labor was panicked out of what most respectable economists considered a good policy. Labor came to the view that the cynical political calculation behind Howard's 2003 answer was unassailable. More people own homes than don't. Booming prices make them feel richer. They are fearful of anything that might reduce the value of their major asset, and they will vote accordingly. As Shorten himself put it recently, when Labor tried to implement change, things backfired. What did we get? Scott Morrison. There is a reason to suspect that this view is wrong, however, and that changing demographic reality is making it more wrong. S. Lake is one who holds that view. Another respected independent economist, Chris Richardson, is another. You're going to bookend your sentence with another? Who's the copy editor. Back in the day when capital gains taxes were halved, rising house prices was a vote winner, says Richardson. It is no longer true. This idea that you're just going to flip-flop on policy according to how people feel really irritates me. I know that politics is like that, but if your policies are based on solid fact and research, and it would overwhelmingly benefit people, then your problem isn't the policy and this idea of it being quote-unquote unpopular. Your problem is mostly Murdoch, Murdoch on education, frankly. So I would have recommended doubling down, but that's who I am. I'm just full of hate. This is very, Ruth Bader Ginsburg being like, yeah, I'm here to represent the feelings of the majority, and so when homophobia was commonplace and gay marriage wasn't acceptable, I represented those views. And then when society changed, of course I voted for gay marriage, or like whatever the bullshit she said. And it's like, you're not... How can you just embrace being a weather vane so smugly like that? I don't get it. And the idea that, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I wasn't paying enough attention at the time, I guess. I just don't feel like being a flip-floppy coward is vote winning, If you stick to the same policies, at least people will understand what they are. They've got time to get used to them. Older voters who own their homes, and often also investment property, are a shrinking electoral cohort. Conversely, the number of people affected by rising prices is growing. Home ownership rates have been on the slide for many decades, and the slide is picking up pace, as Brendan Coates, Economic Policy Program Director at the Grattan Institute, detailed in a major speech in September 2022, using data gleaned from various sources, including the previous year's census. The hell is the Grattan Institute? An Australian public policy think tank established in 2008, Melbourne-based, non-aligned, defining itself as contributing to public policy as a liberal democracy in a globalised economy. Major contributions from the federal government, the Government of Victoria, and the University of Melbourne, and BHP. Jesus. Alright. Between 1981 and 2021, he showed, ownership rates among 25 to 34-year-olds fell from more than 60% to 40%. Among the poorest 40% of that age group, it more than halved, from 57% to 28%. Right. Between 1981 and 2021, home ownership rates in the poorest 40% of the young adult 25 to 34 age group halved. In the early 1990s, it took about 7 years to save a 20% deposit for a typical dwelling. That blew out to 12 years. It was not just the young who were struggling either. The last census data, said Coates, showed accelerating declines among middle-income households too, with noticeable falls in home ownership at all age levels, including older middle-income households. Among the poorest 40% of 45 to 54-year-olds, just 53% own their homes today, down from 71% 4 decades ago. Nearly half of all retired renters live in poverty. Homelessness is growing, and fastest growing among women aged over 55. More than half of low-income Australians in the private rental market suffer rental stress, especially those in the capital cities. 1 in 5 working-age renting households are in financial stress, which is defined as skipping a meal, using charity, pawning something, or not heating the home. Yet dwelling prices just keep rising, albeit with the odd brief downturn. For most of the 7 years to mid-2019, Coates noted, the median Sydney home earned more than the median full-time worker. How can it be, he asked, that a relatively low-risk, low-effort investment can often provide greater returns than a year of hard work? The median Sydney home earned more than the median full-time worker from 2012 to 2019. That's crazy. The answer is complex. One truthful thing Howard said in that 2003 interview was that low interest rates were part of the cause. From a historic high of 17.5% in 1990, official rates trended generally downwards for 30 years to a historic low of 0.1% in December 2020. Property buyers, whether for investment or occupation, grew comfortable borrowing more, and banks grew more willing to let them. This meant greater competition and higher bidding at auctions. People who had only ever seen rates decline maxed out the amount they spent on purchasing a place, unconcerned that rates might go up. When they did go up to 4.35%, further and faster than at any time in at least 40 years, many borrowers were squeezed, property investors included. Those investors put up rents, which hurt tenants. According to some data, those increases covered only about half the increase in repayments. Another big factor driving home prices higher is migration. Australia has always had a high migrant intake with most countries, but it has waxed and waned. Through the 1990s it waned, but in the latter years of the Howard government in the mid-2000s it shot up. Under succeeding governments it has stayed high. The trouble is, we do not have enough places to house those migrants. Over the 20 years leading into the COVID-19 pandemic, Australia's housing stock relative to population declined precipitously to be among the lowest in the developed world. Quote-unquote developed. It is undeniable that more migration makes housing more expensive in the short term, Coates tells the Saturday paper. That is just a fact. If you have more people and you don't add to the housing stock, there's going to be more competition for housing. Furthermore, relatively few of the people who migrate to Australia work in construction. According to the Grattan Institute, about 32% of Australian workers were foreign-born, but only about 24% of workers in building and construction were born overseas. There are those who do not accept that migration is a big contributing factor to the housing crisis. Australia's experience during the pandemic might appear to bolster such thinking, such as property. Do not accept that migration is a big contributing factor. Australia's experience during the pandemic might appear to bolster such thinking, as property prices went up even when international borders were closed and more people left the country than arrived. There is an explanation for that, though. People living, working, and studying at home needed more space. The average size of households shrank. Fewer people per dwelling meant demand for 140,000 extra homes. Another thing that happened during and after the pandemic was an enormous boom in home renovations, which diverted tradespeople from building new places, and also contributed to a steep rise in the cost of tradespeople. This happened at a time when disrupted supply chains made building materials scarcer. According to the best estimate of Tim Reardon, chief economist of the Housing Industry Association, somewhere between a quarter and a third of all tradespeople's work goes to renovating existing dwellings rather than constructing new ones. It's hard to be precise because smaller jobs, such as kitchen or bathroom upgrades, do not require building approvals. It used to be you could get a kitchen-bathroom renovation at the age of 35 years, Reardon says. Now we're looking at a new kitchen or bathroom after about 25. I think he means in how old the house is. It's gotta be, right? But I don't know. I don't usually hear houses referred to like that. Climate change is another factor in the housing crisis, including the impact of fire and flood. Reardon relates an anecdote about the Halloween storms that struck southeast Queensland on October 31st, 2020, causing more than $1 billion damage, mostly due to hail damage to roofs. It took 2 weeks for the increase in demand for roof plumbers in Brisbane to hit the price of roof plumbers in Melbourne. Literally just swept down the country. It took 2 weeks for the increase in demand for roof plumbers in Brisbane to hit the price. Right, so after 2 weeks of them being in demand, the rates got to Melbourne rates? That means nothing to me. All these things have increased housing demand, as have the grab bag of government subsidies for home buyers, first home owner grants, stamp duty concessions, mortgage deposit guarantee schemes, and shared equity schemes. Saul S. Lake sardonically calls them builders and land developers profit margin expansion grants, and notes that once again John Howard's fingerprints are on them. Almost 60 years of history since Menzies introduced the first home owners grant scheme at the instigation of the young Liberals' then President John Howard shows that anything that allows Australians to pay more for housing than they otherwise would have resulted in more expensive housing, not in more people owning homes. Suppose a first home buyer can afford to spend $500,000, and then the state government comes along and says, well, you don't have to pay $50,000 on stamp duty. Then the home buyer thinks, well, okay, I can now afford to spend $550,000. Probably buying the same house because there'll be someone else with the same stamp duty exemption competing for it. I'm sorry, I keep changing his voice, but whatever. In a 2011 submission to one of the innumerable parliamentary inquiries into housing costs, S. Lake calculated about $22.5 billion had been spent by governments between 1964 and 2011 on various schemes to assist home buyers. More recent work updating the numbers, he says, put the cost at $36.4 billion up to 2021. Labour is pushing another one now, a modest shared equity scheme. It seems that the major political parties simply will not let go of the idea of demand-side fixes, despite the overwhelming view among economists that they only serve to increase prices. The coalition's current idea is to allow the would-be home buyers to dip into their superannuation. Oh, that's what I was looking at before, okay. Which would not only push up home prices, but also drain the future retirement incomes of young home buyers. The solutions are not simple. Cutting negative gearing and the capital gains tax would not be a panacea for housing affordability. By Grattan's estimates, it would see prices rise about 2% less than they otherwise would have. According to the analysis, however, it would see speculators sell homes and owner-occupiers buy. It wouldn't change prices very much, Coates says, but, and this is really important, you would still see quite a big change in who owns houses. A number of major studies have reached similar conclusions, says Peter Tulip, a former senior Reserve Bank economist, now with the centre-right think tank Centre for Independent Studies, another think tank I've never heard of. He agrees, there are strong tax policy and equity arguments for changing negative gearing and the capital gains discount. Such demand-side measures, however, would have a trivial impact. The real problem, says Tulip, is supply. As a crude simplification, demand has been growing about 3% a year, and supply has been growing at 2%, going back 5 or 6 decades. Fixing that will require reforms beyond the direct purview of the federal government. It can commit more money to directly funding more housing, and Labour, pushed by the Greens, has done so, but the major choke points are at the state and local government levels. There are planning and zoning laws and regulations that hinder redevelopments close to city centres, encourage urban sprawl, and increase infrastructure costs. Reforming those to allow greater density inevitably meets opposition from established residents. You know, this happened in West End when they put up a bunch of towers, but the thing that, who was the guy? Jono Sriganathan? I forget how his last name goes. But the thing that they were all campaigning for, like, yeah, you want to preserve some of the look of the place, but the more important thing was that the developers kept fighting over how many income-controlled units and the range of sizes of units, because they have like their little cost-benefit analysis of who buys what and what they can get for different unit sizes, and whatever mezzanine funding they've got for pre-purchase and that kind of stuff in advance. And John O'Sree gave them a hard time, and a lot of West End campaigners gave them a hard time for gentrifying, because the people who can afford to move in weren't the current demographic mix of students and poor people and low income people. Like, okay, increase the density, but don't drive people out. So there's a lot of fucking NIMBYs around, obviously. It's like, no, my beautiful view, don't ruin it. It's like, okay, like, go move away from the city then if you want a beautiful view. Like, it's, urban sprawl is so fucking nasty. Just, yeah, I know. NIMBYs tend to be, like, really selfish and not have a great view of, not have a great sense of the scale of things they're dealing with. Like, you can still resist low quality without putting the view from your backyard over the opportunities of other people to have a roof over their head, Like, oh no, they're gonna be shooting up in the streets. Like, okay, build a fucking needle center then. Anyway, Tulip is bluntly unsympathetic to these objections. When it is put to him that knocking down old dwellings in inner ring suburbs to accommodate medium or high density housing will just see them replaced with more expensive dwellings, he says he hopes that's what happens. That's the intention. People living in old terraces filled with mold and rot, it would be wonderful to upgrade our housing stock. The benefit, he says, would be indirect, in that it would set up a moving chain. You build a bunch of luxury apartments, and maybe it's millionaires that move in, but they will vacate somewhere else, and other people will move in, and other people will move in where those people vacated, and so on. So he's fucking trickle-downing housing, is what it sounds like. And they vacate, and what, they're renting again? Like, you can't... They just, like, retain ownership. As evidence that it works, he points to the example of Auckland in New Zealand, where In 2016, they substantially upzoned most of 3/4 of the city, allowing medium density. 6 years later, a study found construction had roughly doubled, the dwelling stock increased about 5%, and rents were down between 14 and 35% than they would otherwise have been. Of course, there are other potential solutions. Alan Kohler, in his recent essay, suggests urban sprawl would not be such a problem if transport links, specifically fast rail, yes, fast rail, were built. Or rail of any kind, just give me fucking trains. And trains with some sort of, like, improved air filtration, please, like, just don't let my... Just clean the fucking air. That should be standard government policy in any government-owned space. Others suggest cutting migration further, at least until the housing stock and infrastructure can catch up. Coates welcomes the $3.5 billion the federal government has put on the table to encourage the state to meet a target of 1.2 million new homes over the next 5 years, and the moves by some states to take greater control of planning. The signs are there that the federal and state governments, if not some local governments, have got the message that what will do the most to rein in runaway housing costs is simply building a lot more homes. That's not to say that other measures, such as cutting tax breaks, finding more workers, and providing better transport infrastructure, will not help. Housing, as Tulip says, is the number one social political issue in Australia at the moment and requires multiple responses. All solutions come with significant cost. As we have seen, however, the cost of doing nothing is even bigger. Is much larger. As Chris Richardson says, even if Australia managed to settle on a perfect solution involving one or more of these options, it will still take a decade at least for it to have any great effect. The housing have-nots, such as John Howard's unhappy renter interviewer back in 2003, will suffer for a long time to come. I don't usually read the Saturday paper, but this Seccombe guy, what's his name again? Yeah, Mike Seccombe. Oh, that was good. That was well done. I liked it. What is this? State of the housing system. Yeah, I think I'm done with that. Okay, so these are housing policies that wouldn't drive up prices and that mass buyback of rentals and slumlords that the UK did ages ago. I'll save them for, I guess, like a follow-up good news video. Because it's 3:53 a.m. now, and I didn't end up drinking any of that caffeine because I was talking to you, and now my eyeballs twitching, baby. Oh. Okay, good night. Love you. Bye.